Welcome everybody to week 7 of our class. We're learning Rabbi Benjamin Blech's book, Understanding Judaism, the Basics of Deed and Creed. We're learning in the merit of a full recovery for our friend Aviva Galia Basima.
Who is that?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask.
Because you said that every week.
Arlene and David Shapiro. They come for a month usually, like every month or a couple weeks every year. And we've all gotten quite close with them.
They're wonderful people. And we're starting tonight on page 81 out of 300 pages. So it is my hope that when we continue this class next season, she will be here with us for some of it in person.
Amen.
And David too, because we love David. Tonight's class is going to get into some interesting topics. And if I had to guess what one idea about the Torah and about Judaism that may send people away or turn people off is the idea of punishment in Judaism and in the Torah. And like many of the other things that we've been discussing, there are a lot of misconceptions, and we're going to do some of my favorite activity tonight, which is myth busting. So in order to do that, we're going to have to first address some of those issues. Everything from giving people lashes, the biblical punishment for certain sins, to a phrase that we hear in the Torah, surely he shall be put to death. Surely he should die. And so some people aren't always comfortable with that, even things like an eye for an eye. So there are some topics that are a little bit difficult, but so therefore I'm going to ask you to maintain an open mind for the next 43 minutes as we go through it, and I think it will change your perception of some of these issues in a way that I hope, instead of turning you off to these ideas, actually turns you on to them. I myself had misconceptions about it, but when studying, and there were some inconsistencies that I always thought of. Tonight's class is going to address those inconsistencies, and everything by the end, it actually lines up beautifully. So please bear with me as we go through some of these issues, which are hard to deal with, at least when we don't understand them perfectly. So just to set the context, until now, and also one other point, is we talked about in earlier classes about the framework of Jewish law, that it's the Torah, but also the oral law, and oral law was later turned into the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is debated in the Talmud, and so we're going to come back to some of those important topics tonight, because that really is part of the, I'll just say it's part of the answer to some of the misconceptions or some of the conflicts that will come up, how that's handled. So we're going to do another exception tonight, right? We talked about how all the laws are considered equal. There are no big ones and no little ones. And we learned that there was an exception, that when it comes to a conflict between the man and God laws and the man and man laws, we don't want to be the pious fool who is standing at the ocean praying while someone else is drowning and saying, I can't stop one mitzvah to do another and I can't save you. We don't do that. So when there's a conflict, we always choose the man-to-man one over the man-to-God one. But now we're going to deal with another exception. And it comes to the idea of, I'll quote Rabbi Blech, reading the words carefully, however, we discover that there is another exception to the rule that all mitzvos are equal. This one is not based on the distinction drawn in the structure of the two tablets, first 5 verses, last 5, but rather in the very wording used for each of the 613 laws of the Torah. There are two kinds of mitzvot. There are 248 positive commands, which the sages link to the organs of the body. Now, the doctors in the room or on the video may say, well, there aren't 248. Actually, there are. From a halachic Jewish law standpoint, there are 248 parts of the body. And after class, I kind of just wrote them down if anyone wants to go over what they are. But there are 248 parts discussed in a Mishnah that talks about the purity of the body. So there, for all intents and purposes, we see 248 organs. And that correlates to our entire body having an opportunity to fill a positive commandment. But the remaining 365 laws, good number, are phrased in the format of you shall not. Every day of the solar calendar carries a reminder that in addition to having to do positive commandments, there are also restraints on us. And when it comes to the positive commandments, we know that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said, "For you do not know the rewards," right? They're equal. We don't know what the rewards are, so you have to keep them all equally. That refers obviously to the positive commandments, the 248 positive commandments. There are no rewards for obviously the sin. Although it is, here it is. Furthermore, although it is true that we do not know the specific rewards for our actions, for they are not stated in the Torah, punishments are in fact listed, and we know precisely what the relative ranking of every sin is based on the severity of the punishment, expressing divine pleasure. Now just remind yourself of that term, divine displeasure. There are three categories of punishment in Jewish law. They go from the least severe to the most severe. The first category is monetary punishments. The second category is lashes, 39 lashes. And then finally, there is a death penalty in Jewish law. And we actually I talked about that in the teaser to this class, because it's one of the more interesting concepts. Is there a death penalty in Jewish law? And the answer is yes, kind of. We'll get to that. Each one of these categories deserves a little bit of attention to understand how it fits in and what the overall, as he says, at the heart of all of them, we will discover a profound principle that clarifies the biblical purpose of punishment and differentiates Jewish law from other legal systems in a big way, in a very big way. And part of the mistakes that I made when trying to understand Jewish law and the punishment part of it, and it kind of turned me off, is because I looked at Jewish law through modern Western civilization law spectrum, when in fact the Jewish law, the system of Jewish law, especially with regards to punishment, is an entirely different system, and I would argue a better system, and we're going to explore why that is. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to go over some of the issues pretty quickly so we can get to the meat of it. So first is monetary penalties. So if one person steals from the other, so you might think, okay, if that happens, then they have to return the money. But from a logical perspective, what good does that do? Right? So someone steals, he gets caught, he has to return the money to the owner. So in Jewish law, you actually have to pay double. Why? Because one, you made him poorer, and two, you took away something that wasn't yours, and that will serve as a disincentive for future crimes. Because if you only have to return what you stole, then there's no downside. So the punishment, and there's no such thing as jail in Jewish law. So the idea is you have to pay back double to be a disincentive to do it, because otherwise you just get caught sometimes and you have to give the money back. What's the downside? So in addition to that, if the thing that you steal is related to that person's livelihood, so let's just say someone steals your car, which is your business, the punishment is even greater, because it's not just stealing an item, it's stealing your earnings, and your earnings may be worth a lot more than the value of the car. So we want to impose a punishment that relates to the damage that was actually caused. So that's some of the specifics of monetary punishment. But monetary punishment is only applied to the first level of sin. It's an external form of sin. It doesn't cause actual pain. Whereas the next level for a more serious crime is lashes. And again, stay with me until we get through all of this. When the crime is a more serious one, there are 39 lashes that are given. The lashes are the middle ground punishment between the financial and the death sentence. And he writes, lashes are, however, a biblically ordained means of punishment. What contemporary liberalism would consider abhorrent finds acceptance in the eyes of God. It is interesting to analyze how our sages viewed the viability of this law as opposed to the contemporary ideal of prison for criminals. Prison, it says, is not a viable option for punishment because confining a person and depriving him of his or her freedom negates the very ideal of the first commandment. I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. God removed us from slavery because we were created to be free to make our own choices, to become what we can, and to utilize our time in the manner of our choosing. There is a concept of slavery in Judaism, but again, it's very different from slavery what we know. And in fact, the law, what will happen is if someone steals something and can't afford to pay it back, that person could become a slave, could sell himself into slavery. But there's a law that says that a person can be a slave for 6 years, and then on the 7th year they must go free. And there's some really interesting laws if the person wants to remain a slave. Like, I just don't think I can face the world. I love my master. I know I paid him back, but I just want to be a slave. The Gemara teaches us that we have to hammer his ear, put a nail through his ear, because that person didn't hear that we were supposed to be free. So there's a whole section on slavery, being sold into slavery, but also if the master, and just again to explain how it's different from how we might perceive slavery, if the master only has one bed, the slave sleeps in it. So there are laws about how you treat a so-called slave. So it's probably not even a good word for it. Interestingly, when it comes to the lashes, and it may sound severe, but there are also laws about that. There is a medical exam that is given before the lashes, and if the doctor says, I don't think this person can handle 39 lashes, they'll give him fewer lashes. And we're going to come back. This is kind of a fun class because we're going to touch on a lot of different things that we've discussed earlier. One of them was our favorite of gematria, the numeric value of letters, which have some hidden meaning. And the word achiha, your brother, is used to describe what happens when you give someone lashes. And instead of referring to just you give him lashes, you give lashes to him, your brother. And why does it say that? Well, the numerical value of the word achiha, your brother, aleph is 1, chet is 8, yud is 10, kaf is 20, is a total of 39. And it says that the Talmud's lesson here is that once the transgressor has borne his punishment in dishonor, he must again be considered your brother. So you're not just saying we're like giving him lashes and that's the bad guy. It's that he paid for his crime and we're done with it. And of course, the question could be is why lashes? Why do we do that? Why are we punishing someone, giving them pain? And it's a pretty basic answer is that, well, the way the human is programmed is we're not really worried if we're tempted to do something bad about having to go to jail later and how bad that it may be. When it comes to lashes, that punishment has to be given immediately, very quickly, after the crime is committed, so that person, the potential person who may commit a crime, associates that crime with imminent pain. And as humans, we want to avoid imminent pain. So the lashes are meant for that, but also save the idea that we talked about before, because it's not as clear on its face that this is actually how it works. And the final category is the death penalty. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time tonight. There's a discussion about is dying prematurely a bad thing? And there is a Jewish perspective that, well, yes, obviously sometimes that's a bad thing, but also there are biblical examples of when someone dies before their time, it could be that they completed their mission on earth and there's no more need for them to be here, and then they can go into the higher world. So it's not so clear that dying early is necessarily a punishment or a bad thing. We look at it different ways. But when there is a crime where the punishment from the Torah is death, the Torah also gives 4 different categories of that punishment. They are halachically ranked, from the Jewish law ranked, from the most severe to the least, in the following order: skila, which is stoning; sreifa, which is burning; hereg, which is the sword or decapitation; and finally henek, which is strangulation, and stoning being the most severe. And that again will go to answer some of our questions about this about the death penalty in the first place. So you could ask the question: Does Judaism believe in capital punishment? Even a cursory familiarity with the Torah makes clear that execution is often the prescribed method for dealing with the perpetrators of many different kinds of crimes. He who kills a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. He who strikes his father and mother shall surely be put to death. He who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. So it sounds like Judaism is a really strong proponent of the death penalty. What needs to be addressed is the almost incredible contradiction to this view, which is found throughout the Talmud. And understanding this contradiction, addressing the contradiction, will lead to a major distinction between the written law, the Torah, and the oral law, the law that goes through the Mishnah and the Talmud that was passed down through Moses orally. And those two forms of law are divine, and the Torah law is the most important, is the most direct, but also the oral law is critical in how we interpret the Torah law. The Torah law the Torah law didn't happen in a vacuum. It came along with the oral law, which helps us understand some of it in a fascinating way. And there's a Mishnah, now we know what the Mishnah is, that teaches that a court, or a Sanhedrin, that issues a death sentence once in every 7 years is considered a murderous court. And then there's another point of view that says it depends on what time frame it happens in, because the Sanhedrin was around for a long time. But some Sanhedrins that gave a death sentence once in 70 years were considered bloodthirsty courts. Now, there are all these sins. I'm sure people do them. Why is it almost once in 70 years seems like a bad, a bloodthirsty court? So he asks the obvious question: how could the sages call a Sanhedrin that carries out the will of God a murderous court? How could they criticize the sages who ensure that the will of God is implemented? If the Torah says yes, how could the Mishnah say no? Either he deserves the death penalty or he doesn't deserve the death penalty. To complicate the problem further, the rabbis deduce from various texts that a number of legal requirements must be met before an execution can take place. Considering them in total, it becomes clear that it is impossible to find a situation in which the death sentence will actually be carried out. So is there a death sentence in Judaism? Yes and no, because it's almost impossible for it ever to happen when you take into context the Torah law as well as the oral law. And we'll get into some of that. And this next little section, I call the defense lawyer's playbook. Why is it that the death sentence is never carried out? So first, we talked about this earlier in Judaism. In court, we need to have 2 witnesses, not 1 witness, but 2 witnesses. And those witnesses have to be kosher witnesses. They have to meet a certain standard of ethics and belief. He writes, as long as there were not 2 witnesses who actually saw the crime, the courts cannot condemn. One must remember that a legal system that acknowledges God as the ultimate judge is not saying that this man should go unpunished. Rather, it means that a mortal court is only commissioned by God to carry out retribution when there is total certainty. Otherwise, we must leave it to God to see that the wicked receive their due. So, there's no circumstantial evidence. There's a story of, it's a good story, it's a story of Shimon ben Shetah. It's from the Sanhedrin, from the Talmud. He swore that he had seen a man chased after his friend into some ruins, maybe a cave or ruins. He ran after him and found his friend dead, and the pursuer holding a sword dripping with blood. Ben Shaita said to him, "Wicked one, who killed this man? Who killed this man? It's either me or you. But what can I do? Your blood was not given into my hands, because the Torah says, on the basis of 2 witnesses, he shall surely be put to death. The knife may have been bloody. The man leaving the hovel may have been the only one who could possibly have committed the murder. But as long as there were not 2 witnesses who actually saw the crime, the courts can condemn him." So that's one really good playbook for the defense lawyers. But there's more. Those lawyers, as we said, have to be kosher. There are a wide range of disqualifications discussed in the Talmud. Even gamblers can't be a kosher witness. And one view on that is not only a gambler, a professional gambler who makes his living as a gambler, but an occasional gambler. Imagine one of the 2 witnesses of a murder, buys lottery tickets once in a while. Not a kosher witness. We are very eager to the Jewish law system is set up so that if someone commits one of these heinous crimes where they deserve murder, the system also has an approach where we don't really want to kill them. That's not, and we'll get into it later, that's not the purpose of the law. We're not trying to kill people, even if they do wrong. But we're supposed to understand the severity of the displeasure that God has over these, and the punishment that is put into the Torah that we all read, we study weekly, is meant to teach us the degree of how bad this thing is. So it's part of that exception that, yeah, there are sins that are worse than others, and it goes by the punishment. But just because the punishment is said doesn't mean that that's the punishment that's carried out. In addition to having 2 witnesses and having that witness be kosher, even someone that's so pure they don't even buy a lottery ticket once in a while, is there has to be a warning. So I call this the Jewish version of the Miranda law, right? There's a Miranda warning, where you say you have a right to remain silent, you have all these rights. But the Jewish Miranda law is very different. In Jewish law, no one can be convicted of a crime unless he or she has received proper warning. This means that the 2 witnesses, the 2 kosher witnesses, who see a person about to commit a crime must yell out to the perpetrator both the biblical text prohibiting the deed as well as the punishment for that particular deed. And you can't just say, "Hey, you look like you may want to be a murderer one day, I'm warning you." And it says, "You shall not murder, and you shall surely be put to death if you murder." But that warning from the 2 witnesses, 2 kosher witnesses, has to be given imminently before the crime is committed. A warning is not sufficient if given more than 4 seconds before the crime is committed. "You look like a murderer, don't do it. You're about to murder someone, surely you should be put to death," and you quote it. And you're 2 perfect witnesses. And he's like, "Oh, okay, maybe I better not do that." "No, I am going to do it." He needs another warning because 4 seconds passed. The Jewish law is very clear. We don't want to have people punished for these things, and we'll get back to that is. But there's one last requirement that's probably the most outrageous, if you will, or illogical. For all of the above to have any validity, the villain about to commit a crime must verbally indicate that he or she has heard the warning and has chosen to ignore it, again, within those 4 seconds. He has to say, "In spite of this, I will do it." So yet the Bible itself, in no uncertain term, mandates, "Mot yumach," he shall surely be put to death. What then is God's will? If he wants the villains to die, why does the oral law make it impossible to carry out the sentence? If he doesn't want a Sanhedrin to be murderous, why did the Torah teach us, "Mot yumach," surely he shall be put to death? The answer, to answer this seeming contradiction, we must understand a remarkable insight into the purpose of Jewish law. It's a concept implicit in the opening verse of Exodus, which introduces the entire legal system of Judaism. Quote, "And these are the ordinances which you shall set before them." Now, Steve raised a point before when we were talking, "You shall have no other gods before me," was actually a mistranslation. It means other. Was it other than me? But here the word is lifnehem, which is literally before them. So it's not a mistranslation. Having recorded the Decalogue, the 10 category principles in the previous portion, the Torah now proceeds to elaborate on the law. The words before them, in the previous verse, Lifnehem, presents us with a difficulty. Ordinances, known as mishpatim, are meant to be given to them, to lachem, to them, not before them, Lifnehem. Why does it say before them when it should be given to them? What's the purpose of this? And in the Torah, there are no extra words, there are no imprecise words, and if the word looks out of place, then that's a sign to us that we have to ask, why is that word used? What can we learn from it? So I said this is going to be a highlight of some of the other topics we talked about before. We talked about the Mishnah, we talked about the Talmud, we also talked about the Jewish preachers, and the most famous Jewish preacher was the Maggid of Dubno. Remember the story with the kid shooting the arrows and always hit the target? And they said, how is that possible? And he says, oh, it's easy. First I shoot the arrow, then I draw the target. So this was a preacher who was good at telling stories that illustrated a certain point. And when I was a child, one of the Jewish books that I read was the Wisdom of Chelm. There was a place called Chelm. It's a little politically incorrect, but these are people that we make fun of, a village of brilliant scholars that give us the example of how stupid humans can be. And it's a whole series of stories from Chelm. And the Maggid of Dubno tells a story from the wise men of Chelm. And there was the wise men of Chelm, known throughout the world for possessing a wisdom that illustrates the stupidity of mankind when we're faced with a serious problem. One of the roads in their town had a very steep incline at the point where it veered around a mountainside, kind of like, I'm sure one of these runs here, right? Goes around the mountainside. There was no protective curb. There was no orange rope on the side of the ledge. And so when horses and carriages came barreling down at top speed, unable to make the turn, they hurtled down to the bottom of the cliff and were severely injured. What was the city of Chelm to do about this terribly dangerous situation? For 24 hours, they sat and deliberated. All the wise men came together. A sharp curve, no protective guide rail, people, horses, and carriages constantly falling off and being hurt. What to do? What to do? And then the answer, in a flash of brilliant insight, came to them. The city of Chelm agreed, in a unanimous vote, to build a hospital at the bottom of the cliff. So, right, obviously that's pretty stupid, but sometimes people think that way. And he tells the story not only because it's funny. He says, the world has often shown the Chelm response to its problems. An outbreak of crime? Build more prisons. Violence, wickedness, corruption? Build hospitals that deal with the effects, but never the causes. Legal systems invariably are set up to tell us what to do after crimes have been committed. Lawyers and judges, full disclosure, I'm trained as a lawyer. Lawyers and judges study the law so that they can respond properly after the fact. But Jews are told from early childhood to study the Torah, our law, not because it is hoped that they will become lawyers or judges and will be required to know what to do with criminals after they have done wrong. Every Jew must know the law because, quote, these are the ordinances which you shall set before them, not after them. Jewish law is meant to be studied by everyone because the essence of Jewish law is preventive rather than punitive. We are supposed to know how much displeasure a certain act causes to God, and that's the purpose of it, is to prevent us from doing that terrible crime. When the Torah states, he who strikes his father or mother shall surely be put to death, or he who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death, it's not describing a post facto procedure to be implemented once these horrible deeds have been completed. It is rather a before the act, a priori, educational doctrine to be internalized through constant repetition and study, proclaiming that if anyone smites or curses a parent, in God's view, that person deserves to die. Read the verses regularly, review the Torah from year to year, understand how much God abhors these sins, and you won't come to do them. Why does God say he shall surely be put to death? I mean, it doesn't say he shall surely be put to death. If the oral law makes clear through all of those defense lawyers' playbook issues that it almost never happens. That's because the written law deals with what should be. The written law of the Torah is ideal. It's what should be. It's how things are, how they should be before them, hoping that we learn a value system that prevents us from doing wrong. The oral law communicates what the Sanhedrin, the court, need to know when the moral principles of law have not been mastered. So the death penalty is there to tell us this is how bad that act is. It's not practically intended, and the oral law makes it clear, to actually be implemented. And the words are followed by God's admonition to the court. Quote, and this is from from Numbers. And the court shall judge, and the court shall save, commanding judges to do everything in their power to see to it that once a crime has been committed, the verdict should be not guilty. So you could hear lashes. You could hear he should die by stoning, he should die by strangulation. But in the real world, that doesn't happen, because it is not the intent of the punishment section of the Torah to punish us, but rather to tell us how bad these acts are, and all of us, even if we're not going to become a lawyer or a judge, all of us have an obligation to study it, to understand the severity of those crimes, not because that's a practical application of the law. In fact, the oral law tells us how to make sure that it never happens. So we get into the issue of an eye for an eye. Right? That's a famous one. Ken, don't say anything.
Oh.
It is reassuring to be told that we are not to be as cruel as the perpetrator. God did not mean an eye for an eye. Well, then why did he write it? If God did not want us to gouge out the perpetrator's eye, why did he say it? We may accept the validity of oral law, but why is there a discrepancy in this case between the written law, an eye for an eye, and its real meaning? And we know that measure for measure, an eye for an eye, means monetary damages, equivalent to the cost of the eye. So the answer, if God meant money, why didn't he say so? Why didn't he say an eye for money? It wouldn't be as quotable, but why didn't he just say that? The alternative would have been for the Torah to state money for an eye, and there is no such thing. Just imagine a very wealthy person who hates another man. He says, I will knock out that man's eye. Let him be blind forever. What's my punishment? The Torah says money for an eye. I can afford it. I'll gladly pay the price. No, it's not money for an eye. The Torah says an eye for an eye because the written law always speaks to the language of what should be, of what should be. Someone takes another's eye out deserves to have his eye taken out. Now, compassion will mitigate the actual punishment. The oral law will translate that into monetary terms, but the text has made clear what the crime actually means in the sight of God. Now we can understand why God chose to transmit a Torah of dual identity. Right? We've talked about the Torah law, the written law, and we've talked about the oral law. And sometimes those two laws appear to be in conflict. But in fact, as they say, that's not a bug, it's a feature. And we'll explain why it's a feature, not a bug. God is in fact one, but he has two names by which he is known. Our sages explain the difference between the name Adonai, Lord, and Elohim, God. And we seem to use those terms interchangeably, but they each have a different meaning. And they're both God, but they're different ways of referencing God that references one of two different attributes that both exist within God. When the Lord appears to us as loving, kind, good, and gracious, he is Adonai, the merciful one. When we perceive him as being strict, harsh, and unyielding, he is Elohim, the God of law. Of course, God in essence is one and the same, always gracious and kind, loving and compassionate. It is only our perception that changes. The biblical verse Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. It says, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. The Lord of mercy and the God of law are one Adonai, the attribute of mercy. In order to be merciful, he must at times be cruel. When he seems cruel, he is in fact on a deeper level being merciful. Both aspects of Adonai and Elohim, the merciful and the strict, are his essence. They gain expression in the two parts of the Torah, the written and the oral. There's something called the Zohar, which is a very mystical book of Kabbalah. You've heard of Kabbalah. The Zohar is the book of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. It says, written law is the voice of the strength and severity. The oral law communicates his compassion. The Bible begins with, Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim created. The world was first created via that strict law. The oral law tells us how the Lord embraces us after we have sinned and says, I screamed at you not to do it, but once you transgressed, let me bring you to my bosom and try to draw you closer once again with love. So they're two sides of the same coin. The written law, the harshness of God, is how things should be, and then the compassion of God, which is relayed in the oral law, is let's find a way not to punish that person and bring them back to the proper way with love. We're not seeking to punish them. So when we talk about punishment, one of the biggest discrepancies with logic and punishment is a law relating to what Judaism calls a mamzer or a bastard. And the punishment regarding a mamzer, or what we would call a bastard, although it's not exactly an accurate translation, is that the bastard child cannot marry anybody else except another mamzer. So it would seem on its face that we're punishing the innocent child when in fact it was the mother and the father who transgressed, and that doesn't seem fair or compassionate at all. So first he says that the word mamzer as used in the Bible is not the equivalent of the English bastard. It doesn't refer to someone born out of wedlock, but rather to a more narrow standard. It's rather the child of an adulterous or incestuous relationship. When the verse tells us that the punishment for a mamzer will not only be for the child, but it will carry on to the 10th generation. So to carry on that illogicalness of it, not only are we punishing the innocent child, but we're punishing that child's grandson, granddaughter for 10 generations. Doesn't make any sense. How harsh a punishment for one who committed no crime? To begin with, we must put the punishment into perspective. God, after all, did not say that a mamzer may not marry. He limited, albeit severely, the pool from which the mamzer may select a mate. But we know that a kohen, a priest, also has a smaller range of possibilities from which to choose a mate, since a priest may not marry someone who is divorced. In fact, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, at the time of the temple, has to marry only a virgin. So if we see it as a punishment, why we're not punishing the high priest, there's a deeper reason for it that's not necessarily related to punishment, although, okay, we'll acknowledge that. But the oral law addresses the inconsistency of this punishment, and that is that the law will go out of its way to prove that that child is actually not a mamzer. And let's say there was a product of an adulterous relationship. They will go back and look at the wedding and find that there were two witnesses at every wedding. And this is not something we do for every marriage, but if there is a case of adultery and the child is born that would be a mamzer, the court will go back and look at the marriage and say, one of those two witnesses, he buys lottery tickets. That's not a valid witness. And therefore, we're kind of just reaching pretty far to say that because one of the witnesses once bought a lottery ticket, they're not a valid witness, and therefore they weren't married, and therefore it wasn't adultery, and therefore the child is not a mamzer. And it seems like a pretty weird way to have the law, and we don't look at a regular marriage and then try to disqualify that marriage unless this hopefully unusual circumstance takes place. But it's something that we do. It's part of this dichotomy of the oral law and the written law. The main idea is that, he writes, the death penalty does exist in the Torah, but it is only there to make us aware of how much God detests every crime, and therefore how much we ought to make certain to avoid them. It's not about the penalties actually being delivered. It's about us understanding what the punishment is to see how bad of a sin it is, and to teach, and because we have to learn it. And in fact, we have to read the Torah every Monday, every Thursday, and every Saturday throughout the year to study each of these laws, so that when the whole year goes by, we've studied the whole Torah, the whole written law. So not a year goes by where we are not reminded of how each of these sins is detestable to God, and it's not about the actual punishment. He closes with the idea, if the Sanhedrin were in existence today, who knows what the attitude of its members would be towards drug pushers, child pornographers, muggers, and rapists. One may speculate that faced with the reality of the contemporary scene, their response would have allowed for extreme emergency measures, yet to really actually do these punishments. So there is a leniency in the oral law, but when things are really bad, so you could ask, well, once in 70 years, that means it must have happened sometimes. Well, yes, it happens in an emergency when society is in real trouble, and then we have to return to the strictness of the written law, using the judgment of this big court of experts to say, actually, we need to go back to that. As much as God wants to be merciful, the laws do exist for a reason. And he says, yet one may also speculate that if there were a Sanhedrin today and a society governed by it, there would be no need for these emergency measures. A world exposed to the teaching of the Torah, going back to last week's class, when we understand truth versus false, not just good and bad that are subjective, if we actually lived in a world and brought ourselves to a world where we saw truth and falseness, and these actions were obviously false because the Torah says, surely you will die if you do them. Therefore, we wouldn't do them, and these emergency measures wouldn't be required, and therefore, these harsh penalties would never be dealt out. So, to wrap it up, the main idea here is that it's necessary to have the harsh punishments to teach us, not to punish us, but to teach us the intensity of how bad these actions are, so that we don't do them. And now we have an oral law, which runs parallel to the Torah law, which goes to great lengths to ensure that these actual punishments are not actually meted out to us, because God is loving and he doesn't want to punish us. But if we didn't have the punishments written in the Torah law, we wouldn't know how bad they are, and therefore we would follow the falseness and do those things. So again, tonight's class for a refuah shlema for Aviva Galia Basima, and not to diminish the importance of that, but we can learn for the merit of multiple things, also learning in the merit of some snow soon.
Amen.
Amen. L'chaim. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff.
Are there any questions? I know it was a tough topic, but I hope, thinking through it, that I would be turned off by the idea of a law that has lashes and death penalty. Now, hopefully, you understand a little bit of what's really there. Steve.
Question. You had mentioned last week that you were going to talk about where if you are asked to kill someone else, if you don't do X, Y, or Z, and you didn't touch on that. Could you just briefly touch on that?
Part 5, next week, we are going to spend 45 minutes on the 3, and we didn't set that up. No, we didn't.
Come on, Jeff, I'm going to turn the lights out.
The 3 laws of martyrdom. Next week, we're going to get into, for what shall a Jew be willing to die? The Torah sources for idolatry and martyrdom, the Torah source for immortality and martyrdom, the Torah source for murder and martyrdom, but there is a time to kill, section 16. So come back
Stay
next
tuned.
week. Thanks everybody watching online. We're getting lots of views online, so I really appreciate that. Thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
Awesome.
Jody, are there any Park City Jewish collective